the relationship between the RSS and Prime Minister Modi.
Well, even look at the Indian cabinet. Most of the Indian cabinet members are RSS.
What got you started into the research and study of RSS?
Whether or not you like or don't like the RSS, somehow many people on the left assume the RSS is on the far right. It's not, which one of the things in my book that came out, my most recent book on the RSS, in some ways the RSS is actually left of center.
RSS 60, 65 years back, not so open and accessible to people. You managed to get in.
Eventually, I won't go into the name, apparently there was one particular person who actually pushed my case.
The Western world thinks about India and its attitude towards Indian government. I ask you this because there's a Tulsi Gabbard there is a Kash Patel there.
Kash Patel, has had, or his family has had some involvement with the HSS, which is the RSS Overseas grouping.
Today we have a very interesting guest, someone who understands the RSS very well, someone who I hope will understand the culture conversations that are taking place in India, someone who probably will be best placed to talk about the language wars that India is seeing and what it's like now for the Hindu nationalist sentiment that's really sort of peaked up in the last 2 decades or so. What is its future, and with the relationship between the RSS and Prime Minister Modi. Professor Walter Andersen, thank you so much for speaking to me on SpotOn.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be able to appear on SpotOn with you for this presentation. And you're right that the RSS has now become, an organization that has much more input than it thought it would have 100 years ago when it was founded. This is the 100th year anniversary of its founding, and all sorts of programs are planned. But it's also, as people look at the organization, how did it change? What is it? And you're absolutely right. It is playing an increasingly important role. And that's something in itself has some concern about, because as you become more important in the political sense, you also become subject to attacks as well.
Mm-hmm. So what got you started into the research and study of RSS? Because that's not a topic that a lot of Western academics pick up.
I was a graduate student at the University of Chicago in mid to late 60s. And my advisor was Professor Lloyd and Suzanne Rudolph, very renowned Indianists, now unfortunately dead. And they had suggested to me that I pick a topic which would have relevance and where you would get in kind of on the ground floor on something, which is typical what happens with PhD dissertations. It's something that's new and started. And they said, we have just seen M.S. Golwalkar, who was the head of the RSS at the time that they had a visit to India in the 60s, early 60s. And they said, we are convinced this is an organization, the RSS, that he leads, that was going to play a major role in Indian politics. It was already beginning to at the time they saw him, but they predicted it would be more. So they said, why don't you do a study? You're absolutely right. Almost nobody else has. There was only 1 or 2 that I can think of. And they had difficulty getting access to the RSS to do studies about what it was all about. And so I did. I decided I changed my dissertation totally, and I had to take some courses, extra courses in Hindi, because I wasn't sure how much the people I would be interviewing would know English. So I'm glad I did. Actually, I did use some translators from the university where I was. Fellow students would say, oh, I'll translate for you, I'll go along. In fact, that's another story, because when I first came, I thought there would be some criticism of what I was doing, because the RSS is was then, it still is to a certain extent now, a very controversial group, but I never had any problems about that. So I decided to go along with what they suggested and do a study of the RSS. And they said, yours will be one of the first out. You're on the ground floor to something that's going to grow. Mm-hmm. And that's very good for you, in terms of our career, because I was getting a PhD to teach, obviously. And then it was, you're adding to a subject which hasn't been touched on very much, and certainly not by academics. Part of that, we can get into that later, part of that is the RSS's own fault, but I won't get as to why they were kind of restricted.
Mm-hmm. One thing you said that you didn't have any trouble getting access, despite, a Western academic still struggling with Hindi, RSS 60, 65 years back, not so open and accessible to people. you managed to get in. What were your earliest conversations like and your earliest thoughts?
Well, I was able to get in for two reasons, basically. One is because the Rudolphs, who they had seen, and they respected the Rudolphs for what they had, because they were renowned, they were fair in how they covered him, and they were fair to me as well in how they described the RSS and him to me. So that was one. The other reason was this was an organization that was going to sort of take off. They, I think, realized that, which is why Gowalka met the Rudolphs. And so they agreed to meet me, though I later heard, many years later, there was a debate about that, about whether it was a good thing to meet me or not. Eventually, I won't go into the name, apparently there was one particular person who actually pushed my case a lot, say we really must sort of get our views out there and try to get it with someone who will be fair. Because up to that point, anybody who wrote about the RSS is either one of their own or someone who hated them. You very seldom got a kind of
neutral person,
someone who was neutral,
listen.
who had nothing at stake in the RSS. So they said, yes, let's do it. And it was I spent a week there in Nagpur. It was a fascinating week.
6 decades later, do you think that the view that most Western academics have about RSS, has it changed? Or if not, then why is it?
It's mixed. To some extent, it reflects their own ideologies, whether or not you like or don't like the RSS. Somehow many people on the left assume the RSS is on the far right. It's not, which one of the things in my book that came out, my most recent book on the RSS, in some ways the RSS is actually left of center in terms of economics. And if you read the Vijayadashmi speeches every year, that's the kind of statement of what the RSS is going to do. And the last one by the President Sarsang Chalak really reflected on stability in India. And one way that you get stability is to have fair wages for the farmer, fair wages for the laborer. This has long been an RSS points, is to focus on being fair to that. And they have even proposed worker control of industries as well. That hasn't taken off.
Even the Swadeshi Jagran movement, that's all about indigenous manufacturing, less imports.
Yes, right. Now, you raise a very interesting question there, because you have a certain internal debate in RSS and the party of the family of organs, include the BJP. BJP, particularly under Prime Minister Modi, has been development-oriented.
Yeah.
Whereas, including foreign investment has been invited. He did that first in Gujarat when he was chief minister, and now as prime minister. And the organization you just mentioned, the Swadeshi Jagran Manch, has long been opposed to that, as has the Bharatiya Mazdoor Sangh, which is the labor front of the RSS, and others. So you have a kind of internal debate, but I actually think that's probably healthy to have that kind of debate, but they do, as to which side gets its voice in terms of translating
the sense one
polity.
gets is that, as India grows, as the government embraces investment, they want to, of course, grow faster. Do some of these organizations lose their relevance in their original state and need to sort of reinvent?
On the Swadeshi issue?
Swadeshi issue,
You still have a large part of the Indian manufacturing world which is still suspicious of foreign investment here, for fear it will perhaps overwhelm, their own. And there's a certain truth to that, and so there's a certain care that you don't let that happen. Like in certain areas, there isn't investment, or very little. They set us a maximum of what you can invest, like insurance business.
Yeah, there are caps.
There are caps. But they've been lifting that gradually. In fact, your point about as India grows and needs more investment and technology, you're getting more business people coming to the side of supporting that, because they know that it's important. And particularly at the government level, you're looking at how the country is moving. The government, by and large, has supported investment, though not totally. After all, they're not going to say throw everything open totally. They haven't done that, and they won't. But they'll move carefully, and the movement has been gradually up in terms of the percentage of foreign investment that's come in.
If one were to talk about the internal policy making dynamics, how much do you think the RSS impacts BJP's decision making on critical issues?
family does, and I'll tell you what I mean by that. The family includes all of the affiliated groups that the RSS has formed, mainly over the last 30 or 40 years, including the group I just mentioned, the Bharatiya Mazdoor Sangh, Swadeshi Jagran Manch, the Vidyarthi Parishad for students, you have a Kisan Sangh for farmers. You have about 40 such groups. They represent specific interests. The RSS tends to be as supportive as it can of the interests of those groups, because those groups are in many ways autonomous. The RSS really doesn't interfere a lot. They do a little bit, but not a lot in their decision making. And they tend to be led by a cadre of pracharaks. Those are full-time workers, trained in the RSS, most from the time that they were 5 years old. Yeah. They've gone through the training system and then they go through the officer training camps. There are 3 of them. And other camps along the way to prepare them to be leaders. So if you look at these various affiliated groups, look at the leadership of them. Well, even look at the Indian cabinet. Most of the Indian cabinet members are RSS members.
Or at least ABVP. A lot of them are ABVP.
Oh, almost, yeah. That's another point I was going to mention. You know, the route, the career route for the typical pracharak. He starts at a young age, 5, 6, 7. Goes through the RSS training system in the Shaka, which he meets every day.
Yeah.
And they go. And in fact, they don't go. Someone will come to the door. Why aren't you here? But they try to sort of welcome them in, make them feel that this is a family. In fact, maybe you want to, the Prime Minister himself has talked about this. What attracted him to it, it provided sort of a sense of a family. But they do that. And they're not all successful. Some people, you know, don't like this. They don't like the discipline involved. Well, after that, if you're liked, and they do look to see who is doing well, then you go to the camps, and officer training camps. And at that, you become a vistarak, which is like an intern. Yeah. And they assign you to various people. I once met an intern, whose name now escapes. This was several years ago. He worked for the liaison person between the RSS and the government. Mm-hmm. And when I was sitting there with him in his office, the liaison person kept getting, oh, so-and-so wants to meet you. And he said, I can't
He's
sit.
Overwhelmed, yeah.
Yeah, I can't sit for, half an hour without some politician coming about something. And why was he coming to an RSS person? Because he realizes that person realizes a certain significance in getting RSS to support you.
Which is why I asked you that how much say they have when it comes to regulation, policy making. Is there a conflict of interest?
Sometimes there are, like the one I just mentioned, but though that's internal conflicts as well. Yes, there are, they come because the various affiliated groups have stances. The Bharatiya Mazdoor Sangh is for good labor, wages, labor conditions, and that they have talked about. The Kisan, the farmers group, has also said the farmers need, good returns on their product. And the government, of course, wants to be often as economical as possible. So you have a clash. Now, what happens is, I don't know if you know the Samanvai, when they meet together, sometimes RSS people will meet with the government people, and that happens at periodic times. Mm-hmm. And for example, in my book, I talk about the one right after Prime Minister Modi's election in 2014. They called such a Samanvai. Okay, here we have the government. How are we going to go? So who do they invite? They invite people from throughout the Parivar, people from experts on education, experts on labor, experts on health, because they also have some hospitals that they run, experts in a whole variety of fields, because the RSS, through its front groups, goes in many areas.
You mentioned education. I'm going to come to both education and history, because those are really core issues when it comes to the RSS. Yes. But before that, I want to ask this, going back to the earlier question I asked, which was about perception, global perception. Almost every second headline of RSS, regarding RSS, starts with the Hindu fascist organization, then it goes on to say, is that something that is part of a larger PR, for want of a better word, failure to be able to address preconceived notions and not being able to sort of address that? Or is there a deeper rooted issue amongst Western elites?
There are those who have been critical of the RSS who have talked about it in those terms, fascist, Nazi, that sort of thing. When I wrote my book in the 60s and 70s, you had a lot of that in India as well, that sort of sentiment. And you still have a residue of that in this country. But I was just a participant, a speaker, in fact, on the RSS at the India Today conclave just a few days ago. And that's an audience of, renowned, scholars and academics and business people. I thought I got a very fair hearing. People were, I didn't hear, oh, but you're talking about a fascist organization. I didn't hear any of that. Now, of course, that tends to be a rather elite group when it comes to these sorts of things. So, but I think that tends to reflect in your initial remarks about the growing Hindu nationalism in this country. I think there is that. I think there is a greater respect for the origins of the culture here. And in fact, a person before I gave my talk at the India conclave, India Today conclave, said to me, use an example from Germany I'm going to give you about, and it relates to India as well. In Germany, the music of Wagner, Lohengrin, and others, often referring, in particularly opera, often refers to the ancient German gods. But you can be a Catholic or a Lutheran in Germany and listen to that and enjoy it because it's an element of what makes you German. And so they said, say that because we have a similar thing. What makes you an Indian? What is it, the aspects of the culture, the art, the music that makes you an Indian? And there are some things. The Mahabharata, for example, is an element of literature that appreciation.
Do you envisage that happening? That, as you mentioned, a lot of it is civilizational culture. It is not religious culture. It is civilizational culture when you talk about this. Whether it's the Mahabharata or whether you take any of other, even a lot of Indian art for that matter. But do you see that happening over the course of
absolutely,
a decade, maybe more, or even now?
And so 5 decades I've been following this. And I'm married to an Indian beside it, so I see that as well through her family. Absolutely, I see a greater respect and attention to art that has roots in Indian tradition. It doesn't mean you have to be old-fashioned. I mean, art can be, you do all sorts of things with art. But much of Indian art has its roots in tradition. The thing that comes to immediate mind that I mentioned at the conclave is at the Republic Day Parade. Did you look at the floats?
Yeah.
A friend of mine counted how many of the floats had a Hindu theme. About 80% of the floats. Even floats from states which did not have a Hindu majority, but it was part of the culture.
Yeah.
And in fact, that's something that many people in the RSS will say, because they now accept, and have for now a couple of decades, accept Muslims and Christians into the RSS. That, this is part of what our culture is. And this is what they've long sort of advocated, because their major theme of the RSS is unity, bringing people together, even though it's unity and diversity, which is the great strength of India. It has long had that sort of ability to have different languages, different castes, different economic units, but somehow it works together.
Comes in together, yes.
Someone said it's something like an Indian wedding. Because I had an Indian wedding. There's everybody's everywhere. But suddenly when it starts, boom.
But I'll tell you, you spoke about an Indian wedding. So in an Indian wedding, there's going to be one brother-in-law who is always going to be extremely unhappy, okay? He's in fact referred to as just that, Naraz Jija is what it is said. There's an angry brother-in-law who finds fault with everything that has happened. And anyhow, that's part of it. But, coming to you mentioned about, the growth of RSS, how it's become now more embracing of, and how people are becoming embracing of RSS. I have to ask you this, that, RSS under present Prime Minister versus the last BJP Prime Minister, which was Atal Bihari Vajpayee. How do you see the difference between the organizations of those times and right now?
In terms of working with the RSS, I think Prime Minister Modi has a certain advantage because he has his party, the BJP, has a stronger presence, both in the capital and over half the Indian states have governments which are either BJP alone or BJP in alliance with someone. So that gives him a certain strength that that Vajpayee didn't have. He was very much right on the edge of staying in power, and they certainly didn't. The BJP certainly didn't have that many states that it governed. It had some, but not what it has today.
So you think BJP speaks from a position of strength now when it speaks to the RSS? Is that what you think the difference is?
To a certain extent, I said in my book and elsewhere that the most prominent person in the Parivar, the whole group of organizations, is probably Prime Minister Modi. And I don't know if you know how he eventually got to be Prime Minister, because there is an RSS link to that. There was some in the RSS who weren't sure about him. As Chief Minister, he was a very aggressive, go, go, go kind of person. And people like that tend to offend some people about that. Anyway, so when it came time at that election for the new government to look at a person who would be the prospective Prime Minister, there was a kind of poll taken within the RSS. The RSS is probably one of the most effective internal polling systems. They go out and ask, at the Shaka and elsewhere in their camps, what do you think? So what do people think who should be the next Prime Minister? And by far, as I understand, the person who had the overwhelming, or at least majority, was Narendra Modi. Mm-hmm. Okay. As a person who kind of represents, us culturally, who represents a state that has grown, because jobs are always important, and who has proved to be an effective leader in his own state. Yeah. He had a couple terms as chief minister.
And Gujarat has seen a lot of prosperity in the last 15 years. Yeah, right. 20 actually. The other question I wanted to ask you is that when you talk about, because we are talking about the fact that you understand how the Western world thinks about India, about the government, also how you see the functioning that's taking place between the BJP and RSS. How do you see the present Trump administration and its view and its attitude towards Indian government? I ask you this because there's a Tulsi Gabbard there is a Kash Patel there, and there's an expectation that they would understand India and Indian nuances better, their concerns better. They have an idea about the civilization, the cultural connects as well. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, in terms of those two people, yes. I mean, in fact, Kash Patel, has had, or his family has had some involvement with the HSS, which is the RSS overseas grouping, that the Hindustan, the Hindu Swayamsevak Sangh. And so, yes, but, Indians in the U.S., lots of polling on this, have tended to support the Democrats, not the Republicans. Yeah. I think that was probably true in the last election, because the Democrats have tended to be more open to minorities than have the Republicans, which has been sort of the more Anglo-Saxon party. That's starting to change again, and if you look at cabinet members, you see that. But I haven't seen the polling statistics yet, though the early figures I've seen indicate that trend is more or less stayed. It hasn't been broken all that much. And I'm told, though I haven't sort of counted it, that there are more officials who are in the Democratic Party who are of Indian background than there are Republican officials of Indian background. That may be changing as well, because the Indian community is a wealthy community in the U.S. In fact, it's the wealthiest ethnic community and growing very rapidly. It's one of the more, often in terms of immigration growth, one doesn't tend to look at the Indian community because it doesn't represent what many people think as a growing immigrant community, which tend to be poor, often has jobs at the lower end of the academic level. Less educated. Whereas the Indian community is well educated. It's the wealthiest community. Where do Indians live in cities? They tend to live in the exclusive areas of cities. Like in the Washington area, they tend to live in the very exclusive area on the other side of the Potomac River. So they have that kind of reputation.
That's a great insight, that they're not even treated as immigrants because they don't fit the bill of an average immigrant. They don't fit the bill. Most of them speak English. There is a small minority, like illegals. There are some, we might want to get into that. There are illegals, and the illegals tend to come from very poor families. But the majority of the some 4 to 5 million are not. And they're the ones that stand out as people either in your workplace or where you live,
And they're even beginning to join the clubs of the upper class kind of clubs, the golfing clubs and that sort of thing. You now find Indian names, scattered about. Look at the Wall Street Journal.
Yeah.
On any day, the Wall Street Journal has a lot of information about who's going where in company. There are Indian names. My wife one day decided to take a look. She was able to pick out about 15 names of clearly Indian names that were there, and she wasn't sure whether there might be more because some might have changed their name to anglicize.
Yeah.
And that is, though the Indians tend to do less of that, but there are some Indians who have anglicized their name or made it simpler so it isn't so complicated to speak or to pronounce.
But someone like a Tulsi Gabbard, she's also in fact going to be in India. She's set to meet the.
But she's not Indian background.
She's not.
No, she's not.
But she's what someone would say culturally connected.
Yes, her family has been attracted to Hinduism. Her father was before her attracted to Hinduism, and the family is. And so yes, and she will appear at Hindu events.
Yeah.
And she identifies herself as an Indian. Now she represents a relatively small group. There aren't that many people who are non-Hindu who have converted. Her family is one. But it's starting to happen as you get Indian temples sprouting up all over, usually quite large. There's one close to us is huge, really huge. It's white marble and it lights at night. It looks really spectacular. And they have events where thousands of people show up. And some of them even have established, following sort of the Christian church tradition of organizations that get people, like a baseball team that plays in a league. You have some temples doing that, getting their own baseball team. And getting
So they're assimilating with the local culture.
Yeah, they assimilate, or getting organizations that appeal to women. Cooking classes, or just getting together to talk about marital issues, that sort of thing. They're doing that now. I'm told that was not common in Hindu temples.
Earlier.
It happened a little bit here, particularly in the south of India, where temples were more than just places of worship.
Yeah.
But you really didn't get that kind of outreach that you have in the United States to temples.
You mentioned temple. Temple is a huge movement for the RSS, how to take temples out of state control. That's one of the recurring themes of many RSS Sangchalaks in the past as well. Do you see a growing space for such issues which were earlier the enclaves of the RSS to now become more mainstreamed as like a general issue that people of India now want to talk about?
Well, the RSS has had to change its views on things to fit changing circumstances in India. But where you find that, well, of course you find it in the RSS itself because they have something called Baitik, which is the conversation. And here again, for those of you who are watching who don't know Hinduism but do know Christianity, Christian churches always have these Sunday schools. And the church normally sends out to all its congregations subjects and readings. RSS is doing that, not with the same topics, of course, but with distinctly what to give it in Baitik. So at the Shaka, you have Baitik every day. 7 days a week, you have Baitik. Usually the Shaka goes for an hour, hour and a half. So some percentage of that will be on a subject, some subject. Interesting. I collected a series of subjects at one Shaka that I know of for about 4 months. It was fascinating. The range of subjects was across the board, and not just what you would think of as Hindu subjects. Things like foreign policy issues, China, for example, Tibet, for example. When they had the problem with China in the north, word went out about Baitik. Let's talk about that, and let's talk about India's role on the Himalayan mountains, and what to look at, what to read.
So what do you think is RSS role now going forward, especially on such issues which are social, which are important for people of India, irrespective of which caste, creed, religion they come from? How do you envisage RSS's role now?
Well, I often think, people talk about the RSS and BJP. They're the two groups that normally they talk about. And that there's controversy, and there's certainly about that personnel as well as policy. But that's not a good way to look at it. That's a very Western notion of how organizations interact. What they have is what I would call a symbiosis. And a symbiotic relationship is when two groups, depend on each other. And the BJP and the other affiliated organizations depend on the RSS to provide them praetorics, which lead the group. They also provide them with openings that they can have. So they have a kind of education, which in fact they call their training character building. And I always forget the Hindi name for character building. I remember what the Hindi word for that is.
Charitra. Character is charitra.
Yes, right. So that they focus on what their major focus is, character building, and they train a group of people who are remarkably loyal to each other, to the RSS, and to certain organizations around the RSS. Look at election time. The BJP relies heavily on Swayamsevaks to campaign.
Yeah.
Recent events have shown the impact of the Swayamsevaks on the campaign. In the Lok Sabha election, the BJP went down a bit after its leader had said, we don't need the RSS. I don't know how a political person could say such a thing, but he did. And it had what I consider the impact was, a lot of people said, okay, we'll sit on our hands. And many of them did. And as you know, the BJP vote went down. Now, the state election, the word got through. This was a mistake. We need to get their support. And the RSS Swayamsevaks came out. Look what happened. Haryana, Madhya Pradesh, BJP got almost 2/3 of the seats in both. Yeah. Much better than they had done previously.
Then they went on to win Delhi as well.
Yeah, and Delhi is another case where they did extremely well.
So you think that...
Well, that's not the only reason. There are other reasons, but that is one of the reasons.
So you think the BJP still needs the RSS to win elections?
Absolutely. Even though they've tried to have a training system of their own, but I think the facts show that that's not nearly effective. Having young boys, and they have a women's equivalent too, committed to each other and working is more than someone who just volunteers. I'm going to do it. Their workers are really committed, and they know that. So if you say, we need to work 18 hours today, okay, what do I do?
They're ideologically committed.
And personality. They're committed to the prospect of what that group is doing.
Two things I want to ask you, Professor Andersen, which is what is happening right now. One is around, particularly one is seeing a lot of these language wars. There's now a huge language war that has erupted, with many saying or alleging that there's some sort of a Hindi imposition that is being made by the government.
You mean in the South?
Yeah, you have the Tamil Nadu government saying that, the DMK government saying that. It's a recurring issue, it's not a new issue, but it continues to build up sentiment. The larger issue is, do you see that Hindi versus non-Hindi becoming a major issue going forward?
It has been an issue right from the beginning of India. If you look at, and I have read the debates when the Constitution was being formulated, language was an issue. It remains an issue. It will still be an issue. In fact, I'm always amazed that India has handled the language issue as well as it has, despite all the back and forth. About we're going to lose seats if they, as people have said, when they redistrict, when they reformulate the districts for the Lok Sabha, because the birth rate here in the north is higher than it is in the south, which is probably true. But we're smarter, we have more. Yeah. The Southerners will say we're smarter, and we have more industrial development in the south, which is probably true. So they're going to work. The government's kind of they know these issues, and from what I've seen anyway of the debate that's going on, they're going to handle this very carefully. It's so I think you're going to you will have compromises made. Now this is where the RSS can come in helpful, because one of its roles is to mediate differences within the Parivar. And you have some in the Parivar who probably say, that we need to have, the representation should be based on population, Well, there are other...
You expect the RSS to play a role in mediating this?
Well, they may. I don't know. I haven't seen that yet, and though it's one of the questions I want to ask people when I see them, as to what extent they get involved in this. But it's a possibility, because they have mediated similar sorts of things. Take labor, the labor issue here, land, another big issue here. The government, even this government, has not been able to resolve it. In terms of everybody's, because then you have the Bharatiya Mazdoor Sangh has a certain view about that, and there are other groups in the RSS, in the Parivar that have different views. So what they've done is something which is a compromise. They've let the states decide on this. So that's a way out, because the Constitution allows that in certain circumstances. Yeah. And so they've sort of kicked it down to the states. It's like in the U.S., the abortion question.
Left it to the
it's a
states.
similar thing, rather than having something on a national level, which would be very controversial, let the states handle it.
Is South the ultimate frontier for the RSS right now? I ask this because, there are still deep pockets that they have not been able to penetrate.
One of the ironies of looking at where the RSS is, it's actually, in terms of the number of shakas, it's actually, quite strong in much of the South. What it lacks is that even though it's strong, it's not pervasive as it is in many other areas. I'd say the real frontier is the Northeast in some ways. And there it's interesting because much of the Northeast has this very strong Christian minority, is how they handle that question. You have BJP governments in almost all of the Northeastern states, which is quite interesting. And you have relatively strong the shakas and various of the affiliated groups. Like they have a group that appeals educating tribals. They have a group that's focused on how to educate tribals so that tribals can play a more useful and productive role in the economy. In fact, a very interesting group. And then they have one for women, for example, and how can we get women to be more involved.
So you think that focus could be, or the priority could be Northeast over South going forward?
Well, I don't want to say they have one more than the other. My guess is, though, the biggest challenge is probably in the Northeast.
For the RSS?
Yes, rather than in the South. The South is Hindu, after all. It has often a different variety of Hinduism, often. But it's in many ways it has similar kind of background. The Northeast, in a sense, is a blending of Southeast Asia and Tibetan area and the main body of India itself. And in fact, I'm told that hotels today. I was asked when we checked in our hotel a couple of weeks ago. I was looking around, and you could tell ethnically there was a lot of people from the Northeast were there. And we know the manager of the hotel we're staying in, which is this one. People from the Northeast often, because their education is often in English, and their levels of education is often higher, and they have a sense, because you have many Western tourists who come here, or upper-class Indians who have a kind of different outlook about how they should be treated in hotels. These, people who come from that kind of background are, easier to accommodate than often others who are not. So, and I've seen that too. Here in this hotel, I've met very few people of that background who didn't speak fluent English.
Yes.
That's because they had, training in English language. They have a certain advantage when it comes to English. The world of the computer. If you have English in the world of the computer, you have a huge advantage. It's hard to operate outside of that world.
Absolutely. You've covered up for all your initial disadvantages.
Right.
Professor Andersen, I'm going to now shift to one segment on the show, which is called the rapid fire. They are quick questions, quick answers.
Right. Okay. I won't say just yes and no, but
no. These are questions you have to answer. If you could have a one-on-one conversation with Mr. Mohan Bhagwat today, what's the first question you would ask him?
How do you resolve the question of making the RSS more relevant in those parts of society where it has not been so relevant today? And I think of rural India, even though it's beginning to make a headway. So what are you doing especially about that? What about education? Because there's a need for education to be more reformed to bring it up to date. Those are the two, and then language issue, the one that you mentioned. I think I would ask him that. In fact, I will ask him that because I hope to see him.
How would you explain the RSS to a group of students who've, let's say, never heard of it in the past in 2 sentences?
Well, I would start with saying, in some ways, it's like the Boy Scouts. It takes young men, young boys, and trains them in a certain kind of patriotic way. But it goes beyond the Boy Scouts in that it has, Boy Scouts doesn't have, around it all these organizations that impact on society. So it trains young men, and it has a women's equivalent, and young women to be productive members of society.
What's one piece of advice you'd give to someone who wants to study South Asia but is too intimidated given the complexity?
There are a couple of books that cover South Asia well. There's a book by Basham, The Wonder That Was India, and he died 20, 30 years ago. But that, in my view, is a great book. Then there are my books.
Of course.
So, on the RSS, because if you want to sort of study a group, what's happening, going forward, and it's readily available. I'm trying to think, what's another good book? On foreign policy, read something by Ashley Tellis, Tellis.
Yes.
He's very good on that, and he's done a number of articles. So I would say those are a couple things that one should look at. I think it's good that you do that. Now, if you really want to know, you should study Hindi as well.
Of course, yes.
Now, I say that even though my wife can speak fluent Hindi, but she's from the South. And she will say, well, what about Tamil, which is her mother tongue?
Of course.
Well, I'd say if you can, but Hindi is really spoken all over the country in some ways. And so I think, and beside that, a lot of what happens in the Hindi language in terms of writing.
Mr. Stalin would disagree vehemently, but I get what you're saying, that, if you really want to understand India, you've got to sort of start with Hindi and then probably build on to get some of the other languages.
Yes.
If RSS were to start a social media campaign, what do you think should be the hashtag?
Social media. What do you mean? That's a very complex issue. What do you mean?
Let's say you have to start, you want to be on Twitter, on Facebook, or anything, that hashtag so-and-so that is there. Yeah. What could that be for the RSS?
I don't use that.
Okay, fair enough.
I don't use it at all.
Maybe that's the revelation that RSS needs, that, it needs to have a more social media active campaign.
Yeah, it may, but, I'm not the only one that doesn't, because I find it, I don't find it useful, to be quite frank, because you get a million voices and it tends to be confusing. I know some people will be very angry at people saying that.
This will also be seen on social media, this conversation. But which political leader, living or dead, would you invite to a dinner party? And what's the first question you would ask?
Who would I invite? I didn't get that.
Any political leader, living or dead?
Oh, living or dead. And it has to be political leader. I would say Theodore Roosevelt in the U.S., a leader who I have long admired, for he really set the U.S. on a certain trajectory. And Americans, he came from the old elite of American society at a time in the early 1900s when the U.S. was taking in millions of immigrants from all over the world, and was able to sort of build an idea that these were potentially productive members of society. We have a similar situation today, which is why I think it would be interesting to talk to him.
And finally, what would be your one, if you were to speak to Prime Minister Modi, what would be that one, I wouldn't say just advice, suggestion, but even an observation to him?
Well, key, I think, for him is how to grow the economy in ways that don't disrupt society. Because growth does disrupt. In fact, as I mentioned to you, within the party bar, there's this debate that growth can actually undermine Hindu values. And I would like to hear his opinion on that.
That's a great thought. Thank you so much, Professor Walter. That's a great note to end this conversation.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you.